Boker Tov. Today's daf yomi is Bava Basra Kuf Samach Beis 162, but we're going to start on the bottom of Kuf Samach Aleph 161, 4 lines from the bottom. So Amar Rav Yitzchak Bar today's daf is dedicated for Shemir for the Chayalim, Hatzal for the Shvuyim, and a Yeshua for Am Yisrael. And this Eis Tzara, Gemara says on the bottom of 161b, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Kol HaMachak Kulan, that any erasures that you do in the document when you write it, that the sofer at the end of it, at the end of the document, he has to write down these are the erasures, and then it's okay. As long as we said yesterday, as long as it's not by the word sharir v'kayam, that you're not allowed to erase. You need to go over the last line of the contract. Needs to basically summarize the essence and what was said earlier. There needs to be chazara on the last line. My time, what's the reasoning? You can't learn anything from the last line. Why? You can't have anything new written in the last line because that could potentially have been a forgery. And so therefore you want to make sure that the last line is just the recap of what was said earlier. And Amram, how do you know this? Amrei Tanya, because we learned in the Brisa, meaning to say that the last line has to be a recap of the earlier things, so that prevents forgery. Because in case anybody sticks something in, writes something in between the last line of the text and the signatures, we might have been concerned that it was a forgery. So this makes sure that it wasn't a forgery. And what's the reasoning? Amrei the Tanya, because we learned in the Brisa, Apostle, if the witnesses, if the signatures were written down 2 lines from the text, that'll be disqualified. Shita achas kosher, but if it's 1 line from the text, it's kosher. And ma'ishna shnei shitin. What's the problem with 2 lines? Why do we say if it's 2 lines, it's not kosher? Dilma mezayef v'kasav, because maybe he'll have forged it and wrote something in. So therefore you can't write it because maybe it'll lend itself to a forgery. Well, shita achas, also if you left 1 line, it should be disqualified. Nami mezayef, because maybe somebody will do a forgery. So therefore, the Gemara says, "Allah shmami na," that even if you left over 1 line, we don't have to be concerned about a forgery. Because the last line, if you would put something in, you can't have anything new written in the last line, and so therefore, shmami na. That's our source for this idea. Says the Gemara, Ibaya. So ask the Gemara the following question: Shito mechta mai. So the Gemara asked the following question. Let's say you have 1.5 lines. What will be the case over there? If you leave 1.5 lines, is the witness disqualifying the document? So Tashma Hirchik as Adam Shnei Shitin puzzle, that if a person left Hirchik as Adam Shnei Shitin puzzle. So the Bride said if you leave over, or the Tosefta said if you leave over 2 lines, it's disqualified. Wouldn't that imply a Shito Melta kosher? Wouldn't that imply that if it was only 1.5 lines, it would be kosher? But Ema Seifa. But what about the next clause? Shita achas kosher. The next clause says 1 line is kosher. Shita achas u'de kosher. Doesn't that imply only 1 line that's left over is kosher? But hashito melchza apostle. But if it's a 1.5, it would be disqualified. So we can't learn anything out from this text. You just can't learn anything out from this Tosefta. You can learn it either way. So we know that one of the ways is davka, but we still can't learn. We don't know which way. And therefore, the Gemara says, "My havila." What's the conclusion? The conclusion is Tashma Tanya, because we learned in the Brisa, Hirchik esa Edim Shnei Shitin Minha Ksav Pasul, that if the witnesses separated themselves two lines from the text, it'll be disqualified. Pachas Minkan kosher, but less than that, it will be kosher. And so we see from here that 1.5 lines is going to be kosher. And for sure, meaning to say, even a little bit less than 2 lines is kosher. So for sure, if it's 1.5 lines, it's going to be kosher. So now the next part of the Tosefta, once we quote the first part, we quote the next part, and they're actually connected. And let's say you have 4 or 5 witnesses. So basically, if you have 4 or 5 witnesses that are signed onto the contract, hold on. So it says the Tosefta, if you have 4 or 5 witnesses that are signed onto the contract, and one of them is found to be karov, a relative, or disqualified, that the rest of the witnesses will certify the document. So one of the reasons why this is presumably brought is because we just said in the Tosefta that if the witnesses leave over 2 lines, it's not kosher. So on Eitzah, what you could do is if you have a lot of space, you could fill it up with non-kosher witnesses because they're not going to disqualify. We just need them to fill up the space. So the Gemara says, we have a source for this idea is going to be a support for the law of Chizkiah, because what did Chizkiah say? This is halacha from out of left field, the Torah achas kulai, that the whole Torah is one. And Chizkiah said, Mil'u b'krovim, Chizkiah said, kosher. Chizkiah had said this idea that if you filled it in with relatives, and so therefore, what Chizkiah says in our context is if you fill it in with relatives, it's going to be kosher. And so therefore, the fact that you have some disqualified witnesses writing on the document does not disqualify it. So that's what Chizkiah is telling us. Ma'al titma. And Chizkiah says, what's my proof for this idea? Or Chizkiah says, what's the proof for this idea? Shari of your sukkah, I'll give you a similar example of a case where if it would be just blank, it would be disqualified. But if you filled it in with something which is disqualified in general, you have more space. You have greater latitude than if it was just blank space, and that's from a sukkah, because a sukkah is completely. If a sukkah will be disqualified if there's 3 tefachim, 3 handbreadths of empty space. Boker tov, Hobbs. Good morning, good morning, good morning. If there are 3 tefachim of empty space, but if there are 4 tefachim of disqualified tzach, you have more space. Meaning, say 3 tefachim of disqualified tzach does not disqualify the sukkah. So therefore, we have the same idea that we're just saying. Of your sukkah possible b'shlosha, but tzach possible ba'arba. Okay, we're going to keep going now, but this is the conclusion of today's daf. We'll keep going, obviously.